Konnichiwa. Today we're going to talk about mono and koto in some of their more advanced senses. Now, near the beginning of this course we talked about mono and koto, and I said what people usually say, which is that mono is a concrete thing like a pencil or an apple or a tree, and koto is an abstract thing like a situation, a circumstance, an action. Now, this is broadly true, and it's certainly the best way to grasp it in the beginning. But then we come across some other situations which don't seem to fit in with that. One of my patrons wrote to discuss the sentence, "Ai wa subarashi mono da," which means love is a wonderful thing. Now, surely love is abstract. You can't put it in a box and carry it from Kyoto to Tokyo. So what's going on here? My patron said that she looked it up on various Japanese learning sites and they couldn't explain it at all. They just said you have to learn which cases you use mono and which cases you use koto. This isn't the case at all. What mono really designates is a thing, and a thing is a noun. So it can be a concrete thing like an apple or a book or a universe, but it can also be an abstract thing like love or happiness. These are all nouns. So ai wa subarashi mono da is the only way you can say it, because I is a mono, not a koto. It's a noun, it's a thing. It's not a state, it's not an action, it's not a condition, it's a thing. And we need to bear this in mind as we look at some of the more extended meanings of mono and koto, as we start to see mono and koto on occasion being used as something like sentence enders. But before we get to that, let's look at some of the other extended uses of koto. Now, one of the most common ones is shita koto ga aru. For example, we might say, Nihon ni itta koto ga aru. And that means, I have been to Japan. And as you see, I have been to Japan is a different kind of statement from I went to Japan. I went to Japan is referring to one particular instance of going to Japan. I have been to Japan is saying that in the past, perhaps on one occasion, perhaps on many occasions, going to Japan is something that I have done. In Japanese, what we're literally saying is the activity, the fact of my having been to Japan in the past exists. Now, I had an Italian patron at one time who took me up on my early lesson on the Japanese tenses. I said that Japanese has only 3 tenses, and that's correct. Japanese has only 3 tenses. And my Italian friend asked me, so how would I say something like, I have been to Japan, as opposed to, I went to Japan? And I explained how that is. And he said, well, in that case, Japanese doesn't just have 3 tenses. It's just like Italian or French or other European languages. It has perfective tenses and pluperfect and all these complicated things that European languages have. And therefore, I should be teaching it that way. I should be teaching the Japanese past and present and future and pluperfect and perfective and all that sort of thing. But that is a perfect example of what's wrong with Western Japanese teaching. It would be bundling Japanese, categorizing Japanese, as if it were a European language gone wrong. Of course, any language of any sophistication needs to be able to express just about any kind of time relation. But it doesn't do it in the way that European languages do it. It doesn't do it by means of conjugating verbs. In fact, as I've said before, Japanese doesn't conjugate verbs at all, even in cases that look a bit more like it to Western eyes. It uses an entirely different kind of strategy. It says, the fact of my having been to Japan exists. Now, if we go from shita koto ga aru to the present tense, suru koto ga aru, if instead of saying 日本に行ったことがある. We say, 日本に行くことがある. We're now saying, the fact of my going to Japan exists. In other words, we're saying, I sometimes go to Japan. Going to Japan is a fact that exists. If we say, どんな人にも失敗することがある, we're saying, everybody sometimes makes mistakes. Whatever kind of person it may be, the fact of making mistakes exists. Now, if you're going to start calling these things tenses, that would have to be the past, present, and future occasionally happening tense, which is nonsense, but then so's all the rest of it. It's simply the Japanese strategy for saying that a certain category of event sometimes happens. The fact of its happening exists. Now, mono is sometimes used in ways that really do seem like a sentence ender. And the first way in which this happens is when we add mono da to a complete logical clause. And what this means is that the logical clause we're talking about as a generalization is a reality. It's a mono. It's a thing. It's something we have to contend with. It's something we have to accept. And this is why we're using mono here and not koto. When we say koto ga aru, we're literally talking about a koto, a state of affairs, a fact that happens. But here, we're consolidating what we're talking about into a thing. It's not literally a thing. It's not literally something you could hold in your hand. But we are using the hyperbole of saying that it is. If we say, Fuyu wa samui mono da, what we're saying is, winter is cold, and that's just a thing. That's a thing. You have to come to terms with it. Someone says, oh, it's cold. And you say, Fuyu wa samui mono da. Winter is cold. Winter's a cold thing. Now, we can actually parse it out in that way. They can make it, Fuyu wa samui is a complete sentence, but we could also be saying, Fuyu wa samui mono da. Winter is a cold thing, and this would be a complete logical sentence. Whether it's intended in that way or not is not always possible to tell, and it doesn't tend to matter because the meaning is much the same either way. But there are sentences when it can't possibly be read as simply grammatical. So, for example, we may say, 希望のあるところには必ず試練があるものだ. And what we're saying there is, when there's hope, there's always a test. A test here meaning something we have to overcome, something we have to do in order to attain that hope. Now there's no way of tying this up logically. We simply have the complete logical sentence. 希望のあるところには必ず試練がある. And then we're adding to the end of it, as a kind of sentence ender, mono da. It doesn't make logical sense, but what you're doing is making that statement and then emphasizing it and also putting a particular kind of stress on it by saying mono da. That's just how it is. It's a thing. That's something we have to understand. That's something we have to get used to. It's something that doesn't change. It's something that's inevitable. Mono da. It's a thing. Now, interestingly, that's when we have mono da in the present. When we put it in the past, it has a different implication. And again, this isn't some strange rule we have to learn. Just as with suru koto ga aru versus shita koto ga aru, there are perfectly good reasons why it has to be like that. The mono da we've just discussed has to be in the present tense because we're talking about generalizations. And the present tense, as we know, isn't really a present tense. It covers the present and the future, and it can, even though it's called the non-past tense, it's really the indefinite tense. It can cover the past as well, so long as it's also covering the present and the future. So it's a generalization tense in this case. But when we say it in the past, it has a different meaning. If we say, 子供の頃にはよくこちらに来たものだ. What we're saying is, when I was a child, I often used to come to this place. monoda here is referring to something in the past. And what it's saying is that in the past it was a thing. And it has a kind of personal implication. It was a thing, it's a thing I think about. It's a thing I remember. To me, those past memories are a thing. They're a reality. So again, we're using this mono for something which is essentially abstract. What's the difference between saying Tokyo ni itta mono da and Tokyo ni itta koto ga aru? The koto ga aru is simply a literal statement. The fact of my having been to Tokyo exists. Tokyo ni itta mono da is in English like saying I used to go to Tokyo. And it has much more emotional weight. It's like saying this is a thing I used to do. This is something that used to happen. And you see, we concretize it by figuratively calling it a thing. It was a mono, it was a thing, it was something that used to happen. Now, I'm not going to go into sentences that top off a logical clause with toyu koto or toyu mono, because that would take us into the extended meanings of toyu and the quotation function, which is a whole other area. But I am going to talk briefly about a place where we see koto used on its own as something like a sentence ender. You see a logical clause followed by koto. And people sometimes say that this marks an order, but that's not exactly correct. What it marks is a rule or a regulation, and that's an important distinction. We'll see why in a minute. So if you go into a dojo and see a list of rules pinned to the wall, it may be numbered and it may say ichi nani nani koto, ni nani nani koto, san nani nani koto. And that's really like saying rule 1 nani nani, rule 2 nani nani, etc. You might go into one of those penguin cafes where the waiters and waitresses are all penguins, and you may see a sign saying penguin o kusuguranai koto, and that means don't tickle the penguins. And the reason it's marked with koto is because this is a rule of the establishment. If you go into that cafe, you are duty bound not to tickle the penguins, ever, however tempting it may be, because it's a koto. And what is a koto? In this case, it's a decision, which also means a rule or a regulation. I've made a video before about the expressions koto ni naru and koto ni suru. When you put koto ni suru on the end of a logical clause, we're saying that one has decided to do the action of that logical clause. When we have koto ni naru, it means that the action of that logical clause has been decided upon. And we have to put that passively in English because there's no other way of translating it into English. But it's not passive in Japanese. As we know, Japanese has no passive. So this is the same koto, a decided thing. And in Japanese, this also implies a rule or a regulation. One of the commonest words for a rule or regulation in Japanese is a kimari. Now, kimari is the istem, the noun form of the verb kimaru. And kimaru is the self-move version of the pair kimeru, kimaru. Kimeru means to decide something, and kimaru means something has been decided. And once again, we're forced to put it passively in English, although it's not passive in Japanese. And I've made a video about this whole passivity problem that English has with Japanese. So if you want to pursue that further, I suggest you watch that video. So a koto is the same as a kimari, a decided thing, a rule, a regulation. And when it's put onto the end of a logical clause, it simply marks that logical clause as a rule or a regulation. If you have any questions or comments, please put them in the comments below, and I will answer as usual. I'd like to thank my gold Kokeshi patrons, my producer angels, who keep me in machine oil and batteries, and make these videos possible. And I'd like to thank all my patrons and supporters on Patreon and everywhere, and I'd like to thank you for attending this lesson. これからもよろしくお願いします。Class dismissed.